Okay, hopefully you can hear me now and see the slides. So I'm going to try and race through quite a lot of stuff in 25 minutes. See how I get on. But basically what I want to try and do is talk a little bit about what TIPC has been doing, or TIPC Phase 1 has been doing. And as part of talking about that, that includes talking about the generic theory of change on which we base much of our work, and something about the methodology used in practice, and refer here and there to the actual work that we've been doing using these ideas. So brace yourselves for some what occasionally will be some heavy conceptual stuff, but I'll try to make it as easy as possible to understand. So first of all, okay, so what is TIPC, and or what has TIPC been trying to accomplish, continuing to try to accomplish? First of all, to establish new narratives around transformative innovation policy, and I'll give a rationale for that shortly. And then in practice to establish a set of demonstrators on how to approach, implement and evaluate transformative innovation policy, or TIP. Build a network of people and organizations working on from transformative perspectives across the globe. We have established or achieved some of this already, but we continue to build that network. And in the practical work, the kind of the policy experiment, which I'll say more about, to do co-creation, sort of using core program and in-country work. Just to give you a snapshot of where we have been, at least in Phase 1, this is a graphic of the TIPC core members and associate members, and I suppose of particular interest here, one of the founding members was South Africa, and South Africa continues to be a very strong member of TIPC. And then we're hoping, especially through the Transformative Innovation Africa Hub, to build a much bigger network across the continent of Africa. And I'm sure there'll be more said about that during this discussion, but also later when we have the official launch of TIA, also here in Africa Week. I said I'd give a brief rationale for this idea of transformative innovation policy, and it goes to this, or let's say is shown by this graphic of these three frames. And basically this is a way of kind of understanding innovation policy over time. So frame 1, screen isn't being shared.
I think it should be fine. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So what do you think? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, frame 1, which is around research and development and regulation, was dominant in the 60s to the 80s, we could say. And essentially the idea here that investing in research and development will then lead, or the assumption was that would lead to innovation, and that would lead to economic growth. And then the sort of the various negative outcomes from economic growth, pollution, other kind of environmental problems, a whole range of other problems, could then be regulated away or dealt with sort of at the end of the pipe. Then we get into frame 2, in the 1990s, and still largely dominant, which was around building national systems of innovation. So recognizing that the R&D didn't necessarily automatically lead to innovation, but actually focusing on on creating the necessary linkages between different actors in innovation systems and working with the policy environment around innovation to encourage innovation to happen, not just assuming it will happen from R&D, but still dealing with the consequences of the economic growth that may have followed. But sort of an emerging frame then, sort of as we increasingly recognize the huge challenges that we face today, climate change, biodiversity loss, rising inequality, and actually, as we just were, well, in a sense, continuing to experience large shocks like pandemics and so on, and potentially more to come. A huge range of very complex global challenges that actually what we need is transformative change, to change the systems on which we rely for all our services, mobility, energy provision, healthcare, and so on. And so this frame 3 thinking is, if you like, the rationale behind our approach to transformative innovation policy. Okay, so we've been doing some work already in phase 1, 5 years now, working with various countries across the world. In Africa, we've been working with 4 countries, three of those, Ghana, Kenya, and Senegal. We've gone through a pilot phase, that's as we call it in TIPC, which involves historical mapping of science, technology, and innovation policy in that country, and an explorative study of a potential transformative case. So in Ghana, that transformative case was around e-waste management. In Kenya, it was around nomadic education, and in Senegal, around the virtual university. What would then happen is following the identification of a transformative case would then be an experimental policy engagement, and I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. But Ghana, Kenya, and Senegal, we haven't got to that point, so those policy engagements have not yet been determined. But in South Africa, where we have also done the pilot phase, South Africa is now implementing several experimental policy engagements, or policy experiments, as we often call them. And I'll talk a bit about one of those in which we were directly and deeply involved, Living Catchments project, and that involved people from TIPC, but also from the Trilateral Research Chair, which I'm part of, with people at the University of Johannesburg and colleagues in the African Centre for Technology Studies in Kenya. Okay. The experimental policy engagement, we can say, has sort of 4 components, 3 or 4 components. First of all, there's there's generic theory of change, and I'll explain that shortly. That's where we get into the heavy conceptual work. And we would sort of use that generic theory of change as a basis on which to engage in the development of a specific theory of change in any particular policy experiment. Then there is the component of transformative outcomes, and again, I'll explain what those are shortly, and a formative evaluation approach, which we use to in the policy experiments to develop what can be seen as an evolving monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or MEL framework. So the generic theory of change, this is where I start to get into the sort of heavier conceptual work. I want to try and explain what that is and give you a sense of why you can think of it as a theory of change. But I'll start with thinking about a real case, let's say. So here it is about offshore wind generators and what kinds of things need to be in place for offshore wind generators to be considered a successful technology. And there's a whole bunch of things there on the slide. Core technology, skilled workforce, the technology or the system needs to be profitable, there needs to be demands, there needs to be good policies, etc., etc. There's a whole range of things that need to be in place for that technology really to work. It's not simply the wind turbines. We could probably fill that slide and more with many, many other things as well. So that's quite a complicated set of things, which we can also, we can kind of roughly categorize. So I'm going to roughly categorize them here into 5 areas. So technological, and into science, into policy, into user and markets, and finally into socio-cultural aspects. Now, we could discuss the categorization here, we could expand some of these, and so on. In a sense, that's not really the point of what the slide is trying to show. The slide is trying to show that there are a number of these different things that can be considered to be operating in sort of domains of similar sorts of practice. So technological, the technological domain, the science domain, the policy domain, etc. Now, I'd ask you to hold in your mind those 5 categories, not all the things involved in the categories, but the 5 categories, because I'm going to come back to those after the next slide. But this is kind of, if you like, an illustration of many of the kinds of things that are going on in these 5 categories in a functioning socio-technical system. And incumbent systems, the dominant systems that provide for our services across the world, in countries and across the world, tend to be stable. And the sources, the reasons for that stability are many, but they tend to be things that we can categorize as path dependencies around capabilities, economic structures, vested interests, compatible infrastructure, institutions, rules, and technological and user cultures. And all of these things link together in these incumbent socio-technical systems to mean that they are highly stable, very difficult to change. The social and the technological, the material and discursive processes co-evolve and reinforce one another. So if there is some kind of change in one of these dimensions, that tends to be, in a sense, resisted by the others. And that leads to a process of what we can think of as lock-in. These are all sources of stability, but there are also sources of instability. At least, there are sources of instability. So things like environmental change, climate change being an obvious form of that. Social pressures, so social pressures to see change. If we're thinking about climate change, then that might be demonstrations, youth demonstrations, for example, which have been very high profile across the world in recent years. Demographic changes, so increasing youth population, seeing their future threatened by climate change, are then joining those demonstrations to raise that social pressure. But also changes in development ideologies. There's been, following the financial crisis in 2007 and 8, the belief in markets as solutions to all our problems has been shaken. We're in perhaps a process of flux where it comes to development ideology at the moment. But there are also kinds of internal dynamics and contradictions in these socio-technical systems that provide for our services. Alongside all of that, we get major events. We think about the COVID-19 pandemic, hugely disruptive across the world. We're sort of learning to live with it, but experts are telling us that we can expect more pandemics in the future, but also other kinds of disasters, earthquakes, droughts, etc. These major events can create huge pressures on the incumbent systems. Looking sort of slightly more positively, we can see that these instabilities can provide opportunities for alternatives to the incumbent systems that we have, opportunities to do something different. recognizing that these instabilities provide opportunities, we can then think, well, how can we deliberately disrupt these systems in let's say, relatively controlled ways in order to promote alternatives. So we can think about using policies and programs, projects, and so on to do this destabilization or disruption of the incumbent systems, while at the same time promoting the alternatives. So this then hopefully gets me into the actual theory. And first of all, I want to go back to those 5 categories and show how we conceptualize what these incumbent systems look like. So we, generally speaking, put them, sort of link them together in this kind of pentagon: sociocultural, science, policy, technological, and user and market dimensions to this system. And we think of these systems over time evolving in the same direction in a kind of lockstep process. So these lines kind of represent that directionality of a system. They're locked together, so we see these nice straight lines just going on and on into the future. And what keeps those different dimensions aligned with each other, changing in the same direction, are the things I mentioned about co-evolution, path dependency, shared rules, lock-in. And this system in our generic theory of change is what we call the regime. And a transition then is a change from one regime to another, or a socio-technical regime to another. So now putting this into the theory of change, generic theory of change, is where hopefully you are now, your coffee has worked and you're awake, because there's quite a few elements to this. But we'll start, first of all, with the broad sort of outlines of this, where we conceptualize the systems as working within a broader context, which we call a landscape. And the landscape is made up of, generally speaking, slowly changing phenomena, values, for example, or demographic changes, or various kinds of trends, things that we can't easily influence quickly or directly. And that includes, of course, events and disasters. The regime then sits in this particular scheme in the middle, or regimes sit in the middle, the dominant practices, the incumbent systems, and these are very stable. And then we think of this bottom level here, where there are various niches. And niches are places that are spaces where there is experimentation with new ideas, new technologies, new practices, new rules, as potential alternatives to the regime. And you might just notice along the bottom here, I've got a time axis. So I'm going to give this, the theory of change, involves time. So we put this regime in the middle here, with its very stable set of dimensions all working in the same direction. And for the sake of argument, call that very crudely the fossil fuel regime. At the bottom here, while the fossil fuel regime may be very stable, or at least in this example of theory of change, at the bottom we have activity at the niche level, experimenting with alternatives to fossil fuels, but not yet well established, not well structured. We don't quite know what the rules are and the institutions are that we need here. So we might think of that, again, very crudely speaking, as a renewable energy niche. In the landscape level, we've got these slow changing dynamics. And an example of that would be climate change, and climate change putting pressure on the regime, which then needs to respond to that pressure if it is going to exist. And we can represent that pressure on the regime, that destabilization by these kind of broken arrows, are sort of representing search activities and trying to find ways to respond to climate change, such that fossil fuels can continue to be profitable for those interested. We can continue with our lifestyles without too much disruption, using fossil fuels, etc. So there's a whole bunch of searching and trying to figure out how to respond to the pressure of climate change to maintain the fossil fuel regime. If during this so-called window of opportunity of instability in the regime, in the renewable energy niche, we have established working technologies. We understand I should say that the niche is now becoming well structured. We understand what kinds of policies and regulations need to be in place for the renewable energy systems to work. We now have a relatively stable niche, which may be strong enough to replace the fossil fuel regime with what is now a renewable energy regime. So now we have a new regime, stable. Again, it's all the dimensions are all working in the same direction, and the direction of change is established. And so even if there are other activities now going on in the niche, so arguably I put here nuclear fusion niche, even if there are activities at the niche level, because the regime is stable, then it's quite possible that these other niches will sort of fade from interest. And of course, the final piece of this, the thing that we're trying to address, is climate change, and the idea being that with renewable energy regimes now in place, we have, or hopefully have, mitigated climate change. So that's a sort of generic theory of change. And it is highly idealized, of course. Everything's kind of moved smoothly from left to right here across time. Real transitions or transformations of this kind, of course, are much messier. But the point here is to try and illustrate the dynamics between these three levels as we think about them, and to recognize the kinds of things that need to happen for for system change to take place. The next part, so that's the generic theory of change. The next part of importance in terms of the way that we do policy experiments is this idea of transformative outcomes. And what these are intended to be are a guide to interventions, a way to help actors think about their interventions and how they can evaluate those interventions, the projects or whatever, when they're practicing transformative innovation policy as a way of monitoring what they're doing. Are they actually leading? Is the intervention actually leading to system change? So the transformative outcomes are related. They come out of the thinking in this generic theory of change. And we sort of categorize them in three, we put them into three categories, each category having 4 outcomes. I'm not going to talk through all the detail of them, but we've got categories around building and nurturing niches, the alternatives to the incumbent system. Then we've got transformative outcomes around expanding and mainstreaming niches, and crucially, transformative outcomes about unlocking and opening up regimes, destabilizing, to use a word common in the literature on this. So to go back to this diagram, then, to give you a sense of what transformative outcomes might look like in terms of the generic theory of change, I've just overlaid 3 types of transformative outcomes on here. So we've got, for example, subsidies for rooftop solar PV could be considered a form of shielding, because what you're doing there is shielding what might be expensive solar PV against market forces when competing with potentially cheaper but dirtier technologies, energy technologies. So by subsidizing solar PV, you're then able to get solar PV at a competitive price with other technologies in the market. And so that gives you the opportunity to improve the technology, lower the costs, and eventually, hopefully, remove the subsidies, and the technology competes. Or perhaps is even cheaper and can win in the market under normal market selection pressures. So that is one form, let's say, one example of shielding. Then an example of institutionalizing would be creating standards for solar PV installations. So customers know what to expect. They know, there is a standard. They can trust the technology to work. There are regulations in place to impose sanctions on companies that don't meet the regulations, etc. So it's a form of institutionalizing. And then in terms of de-aligning and destabilizing the regime, an example there would be creating a coal phase-out policy. So it's not a sort of revolutionary destabilization, it's a controlled destabilization, as it were. So coal is going to be phased out. That gives important signals to other actors. Okay, and now generic theory of change, transformative outcomes. Then in terms of the work that TIPC's been doing for policy experiments, bringing those two things together, we have this methodology that we've used or are using, which breaks down into three broad steps of using the generic theory of change in conversation with the partners involved in an experiment to develop a specific theory of change to that project or program. Once that specific theory of change then is developed, it's about connecting the transformative outcomes with that theory of change to identify much more specific activities with expected outcomes within their theory of change, and then finally to develop the monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan based on formative evaluation. This is not a MEL plan that is about sort of ticking boxes at the end of a project. It's about understanding the directionality of activities within the project and to be able to change what you do in response to recognizing whether you are leading to system change or not. We've done this in South Africa with the Living Catchments project I mentioned earlier. And so I'd just say a little bit about that, a bit more detail about that. So there we actually, it was a deeply co-creative process. It was conducted over the summer of our summer of 2020 during lockdown, so it was all online. And working with the Living Catchments team from South African National Biodiversity Institute and people from the Water Research Commission to develop a theory of change relevant to strategic water source areas in South Africa around new ways of doing water governance and water security. The process, as I say, was about a conversation, thinking about our generic theory of change and what the project was trying to do. And if you like, understanding the challenges around water security in these water source areas in terms of, who are the main actors, what are the dominant ways of doing things, the regime, and the Living Catchments project as a kind of niche, and how to strengthen that niche and scale up and influence the regime, which in sort of crude terms translates into the regime being built infrastructure, pipes, dams, this kind of engineering solutions to water security. Whereas the niche was about introducing much more ecological solutions, not abandoning the engineering solutions, but working together, ecological infrastructure, as they would call it, and the built infrastructural solutions to water security. So we worked through this in 7 interactions online with the whole process to develop the theory of change, identify relevant transformative outcomes, not the whole list of transformative outcomes, but ones that were relevant to what the project was trying to do, and then finally into a monitoring and evaluation and learning plan to actually make sure that the project could really achieve the intended outcomes. And this is a graphic, then an infographic of the theory of change as developed, or at least the highlights of the theory of change as developed in the Living Catchments project. I'm certainly not going to go through the details of this, but it's quite a lot more, quite a lot stretched compared to the original ideas I think everyone involved in this experiment would suggest. And we were yesterday at a meeting of the Living Catchments team, who are coming towards the end of the project now, and they were discussing some of the outcomes that have been achieved. And I won't go into the detail of those either, but basically it is a very optimistic, encouraging set of outcomes in terms of how this kind of approach, working with this sort of transformative theory of change, transformative outcomes, and really interrogating what you're trying to achieve to really lead to system change. It looks very promising in terms of the practical approach. So it was a marvelous experience to be there yesterday in that meeting. Perhaps some of that just some of the detail of this will come up in our discussion, or perhaps even later in the afternoon session launching the Africa Hub. Final thing I want to say is all of the work that's gone into TIPC over the past 5 years has sort of been collected into a set of resources, which you can find on this website, tipresourcelab.net. It's a huge resource that you are free to use. It's completely open. So I just wanted to point that out. And as a good academic, I always put the references at the end. And thank you.